I'm Dr. Johnny Drain, material scientist, and it is my great pleasure to have with us today Harold McGee, author of Food Bible on food and cooking. Welcome, Harold. Great to have you here.
Hello, Johnny. It's a pleasure to meet you and to be with you.
So, your book on food and cooking has become a Bible for many chefs and home cooks. And in it, you sort of unpick and explain the science and history behind a huge number of the foods that we eat and take for granted. Can you just explain to me a little bit about what prompted you to write such a book, which didn't exist before?
I started writing about food because I couldn't get a job teaching poetry. And I had friends who were interested in food and cooking. We would get together regularly to do potlucks, and around the table we would chat about all kinds of things, but often it would be the subject at hand, the food that was on the table. And enough questions came up about, why things behave the way they do, why our bodies react to certain foods the way they do, that I just thought it would be fun to see if there was any information out there in the world about that kind of thing. This is the 1970s, a long time ago. So I went to the library and poked around the stacks where I don't usually hang out, and discovered these journals, Poultry Science and Cereal Chemistry and things like that. And it was just a new world opening up to me. And I couldn't wait to tell my friends about it. And then that kind of made me realize that maybe I could tell more than my friends about this kind of thing. And proposed a book to a publisher, and back then it was a new idea, and so I got a contract and wrote a book.
And did you have a background in science at that point, or you were a poet and the science was new, but you went down the rabbit hole?
Actually, my first love in life was, for a long time, astronomy. So I did go to university to study astronomy, and did the requisite physics and chemistry for a few years, and then decided, that after all, what I was really interested in was not so much the math of planetary orbits. It was, the feeling that knowing about that kind of thing elicited in us, the realization that the universe is as huge as it is. So that led me to philosophy and poetry, and kind of dead end job prospects. And so I was then able to kind of recoup my interest in science in a very different area. But really, it's in some ways it's the same kind of thing. Gastronomy and astronomy, they're almost the same word, and it seems to me that they're both about understanding our relationship to the world. What is it that really moves us and gives us pleasure about things in the world around us? And knowledge about the stars is one thing, but putting something delicious in our mouths is another.
Amazing. And I think there's a deep poetry in the skies as well as the bowls in front of us. I'm curious, obviously in the 70s and when the book first came out, the first edition in the early 80s, the science wasn't there to understand that there was a specific receptor for umami. Did you know anything about the idea of umami at that time, or what did that word mean to you, or when did it first come onto your radar?
Well, so I started writing my book in the late 1970s. And at that time, monosodium glutamate was infamous for causing the so-called Chinese restaurant syndrome. So I studied MSG and wrote about it in that context. But also, I said MSG is a mysterious substance because we really didn't understand anything except that somehow it enhanced flavors, that it wasn't necessarily a flavor of its own, but it made foods delicious, and that's why it was added to foods. As I say, back then we didn't really know about taste receptors. This is a long, long time ago. But then what happened was that after my book was published in 1984, I went to a meeting, and I met Dr. Morley Kerr, and he was the director of the Monell Chemical Senses Center. And he had just finished editing a volume that was called Umami, A Basic Taste. So he was one of the few American scientists or Western scientists who thought that, in fact, MSG and related compounds were responsible not just for enhancing taste, but for providing a very basic one. And I remember sitting at a table at breakfast with Dr. Kerr as he explained the evidence for this. And I was thinking, oh man, I just published a book and I said it was a taste enhancer. And in fact, it's way more than that. So I had to wait 20 years for the opportunity to correct myself. But it was really exciting to hear from a real pioneer in the area that, in fact, there was this newly developed understanding that would change the way we think about flavor.
So there's a lot of bunkum spoken about MSG and this Chinese restaurant syndrome. Once and for all, could you share with us what is the sort of the top line and the reality of that?
Well, the top line is that there really is no such thing. There have been literally hundreds of studies done in countries all over the world over the last 50 years, and none of them have found any evidence to support the idea that MSG causes anything like the symptoms that were described as the Chinese restaurant syndrome, which were, they were just uncomfortableness, nothing more than that. So a minor kind of symptom to begin with, and no evidence that there's any connection between MSG and those symptoms.
Brilliant. Thanks for clearing that up. And what do you think the role of umami is for humans? Why do we have a receptor?
Well, that's a really good question, and I think the jury is still out. There are theories, but it may be the kind of thing that's just impossible to prove one way or the other. But we have umami receptors because primates have umami receptors. So our ancestors had them, and they've given them to us. So the question is really, why does our branch of the animal kingdom have these receptors? And the way I like to think about it is that the receptors are for sweet, sour, bitter, and umami are in our mouth to give us information about what it is that we're putting into our mouths. Sweet and sour and bitter have very specific, very clear causes and reasons for being. In the case of umami, my sense is that it's more a kind of general encouragement to continue eating. It's a harder sensation to pin down, and it, to me, involves a kind of general overall mouth-filling, pleasant, and long-lasting sensation, all of which I think contribute to a desire to have another bite, So it's not so much that I think that we're wired to want a specific nutrient. Salt is important for our bodies, and bitter compounds are often toxic, and so it's good to be aware of them and to know that they're there, even if we go ahead and eat something that's bitter. But in the case of umami, it seems to me it has more to do with just a general sense of well-being, and that this is a good thing that I'm doing. I'm nourishing my body.
Amazing. I totally agree with you that it is more challenging to describe, to share with a fellow diner what umami is. Do you have a sense of why we find, or most people do, find it more difficult to describe that sensation versus, the acidity of a lemon or something?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I don't have an answer. And I'm encouraged that when I read the technical literature, scientists who study taste for a living also have a hard time coming up with an answer to that. But I think that's part of what makes it interesting. It's not clear. The more that you pay attention to it, the more evident it is that it's an important aspect of eating. And I think that that just makes it a fascinating thing to think about and to experience.
I've got a question prepped, but this is a more of a tangent. I don't know if it'll make the cut, but I was just thinking your description then went back to you talking about poetry, and I was thinking, well, if acidity and bitterness were sort of rhyme and meter in a poem, these very concrete things, I wonder what umami would be in poetry.
Well, that's a wonderful way to think about it. The immediate thought I have is flow. It's just kind of the way a poem will just kind of take you along with it. So it's not punctuation, it's not an exclamation point, which acidity might be, for example. Of course, all of these things depend on how prominent that aspect of the food is. Anything that's super prominent is going to be an exclamation point. But if I think about a well-balanced bite of food, it would be the continuity, the flowing from line to line.
I love it. Umami is poetic flow. Brilliant. The other question I had lined up was actually you spoke of primates, and when we've done these series with chefs and scientists before, we talk of sources of umami and parmesan or sun-dried tomato or katsuobushi or whatever. Those primates were not eating parmesan, we must presume. What were they eating that had lots of umami in?
So that's also a really good question. The primates that we usually think of as our immediate ancestors were vegetarian. They were leaf eaters for the most part. And I know that Gary Beecham, for example, a scientist who has devoted much of his life to understanding umami, thinks that that's a really important key, that green leaves are very nourishing. They're high in protein. They're not high in the ribonucleotides that also are synergistic with glutamate, and which you do find more of in things like meats and shellfish and mushrooms. So his feeling is that it was the leaves that really provided that sense of continuity. And if you think about it, gorillas and chimpanzees who are eating leaves most of the time, they have to spend a lot of their day chewing. That wad of leaves is in their mouths for a long time, and so anything to make that an easier, more pleasant kind of process would probably be welcome. The other thing, though, that I've begun to think about a little bit is more recent history of humans and their dispersal out into the world from Africa. It's looking as though much of that migration took place along seacoasts. And seacoasts are where you find shellfish, and shellfish are very rich in umami containing compounds. So now this is very recent history for the human race or the human species. So it probably hasn't had an evolutionary impact, but I wonder whether it's had some influence on the prominence of that aspect of flavor in modern humans.